Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn about computer components using video games. Hey there everyone. Today we're going to be taking a bit of a different approach when it comes to learning about computers. Today we're going to be playing PC Building Simulator, and as you've guessed, we're going to be learning about PC parts and every component that makes a computer run. So before we get started, why don't you go ahead and get a notepad. We're going to be running over a lot of different concepts just so that we can understand what the magic is that makes everything happen. Now, most of today is going to be me walking you through this tutorial on how to build a PC, while explaining some of the concepts as we follow along. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go ahead and boot this up, and any second now. There we go. How to build a PC mode. This will walk us through every step that comes in building a computer, and I'll go ahead and explain the difference between what you'll be seeing here and what you usually have on a laptop or a phone, and how they compare. So in this case, when it comes to actually building a computer, you have the opportunity to remove the case. So we're going to go ahead, click, and start with looking at the internals. Right now what we're looking at is just what's essentially a scaffold. We're just looking at the structure where we'll be placing all of our pieces. So far we have none of our computer parts inserted, so we're going to go ahead and actually, let me see how I rotate the camera. We'll take off our second panel, and now it's asking us to install the PSU. What's a PSU? Well, the PSU stands for a power supply unit. A power supply unit is essentially just the system that controls the amount of electricity coming into your computer, as well as allocating it to your motherboard so that it can send the power to everything else. With power supplies, you usually don't have to worry about them as parts inside of laptops or phones, because in phones they're already placed in as batteries, whereas with laptops, again, batteries, but with a desktop tower you don't have a battery. You just have something sending electrical current in and applying it exactly where it needs to be. Let's go ahead and install this power supply now. I'm going to have to twist around this way. We're going to take off a mount. When it comes to understanding how computers work, this isn't really part of the process. Like I said, this is a game, so there's going to be some game elements to it to add some extra steps. But let's go ahead and actually look at the part. So you can tell you have a fan or a power supply through just looking at this, what's essentially a black box. Obviously you can find them in different colors, but in most cases you'll find them in these square boxes with a large, very noticeable fan and this main power outlet, along with this side, which will connect into your computer. So let's go ahead and install this by just clicking here. Get all the monotonous stuff out of the way, like these screws. Boom. Any second now. And like this, we can go ahead and move on to our next component. So now we've moved on to the motherboard. And let's go ahead and take a look at the motherboard before I go ahead and explain it. So back over to my inventory. And now we get to look at the mothership, or the motherboard actually, but it kind of functions like a mothership, because just in the same way that a mothership would control all the other aliens and organize them together, our motherboard organizes all of our computer parts together and gets them to talk to each other, gets them to actually function. But let's go ahead and take a look at the important parts on this board. There's a lot here, but I'll point out what really matters. To go ahead and start off, our CMOS battery, when you actually build a computer, will oddly be one of the most important parts because it keeps the clock of your computer running. It takes care of keeping every single thing synchronized. Then here we have our I/O ports. I wish I could have this not be upside down, but this includes your audio jacks and your USBs, HDMI as well in some cases. Here we'll have our RAM slots. That will act as our memory. If you play video games, RAM can be very useful, but we'll get into that once we actually touch on the part that's tied to it. We have our CPU socket, the central processing. It's conveniently placed somewhere near the middle and or in a place where it can be connected to some of the most important parts, or close to the power, just so I can get that extra little bit of juice. So let's go ahead and get this installed. I'm gonna have to rotate this way, and this nice open area will actually line up perfectly with the screw holes inside of our motherboard. So we're gonna click here, and you can see that we've applied these screws. Now, if you're just looking to understand general computers, these have absolutely nothing to do with them. These are called standoffs, and they essentially just make sure your computer, which is running a lot of electricity through it, doesn't accidentally send that electrical current through this metal case and fry everything. So, safety precaution. Let's go ahead and screw these in. And like this, and I can promise it's going to be a lot harder than a click when you actually do this. I've had situations where these motherboards or these parts are actually a little sharp and you can end up cutting yourself. But now we can actually go ahead. We connected our power supply and we'll run over onto this end. Oh, no, it's gonna want right here. And like that. Let's see, we've got something missing. Huh, just 1 second. Sweet, so I found my issue. But let's go ahead and get started by, continue by connecting the main power supply. The 24-pin connector, which even though it doesn't power the entire motherboard, will power a lot of the beefy parts that really matter. So let's go ahead, plug that in right here, and now we can get to the CPU. So now the CPU, or the central processing unit, kind of in the same way that we process what we think of, or we process some changes in our lives, we will have a processor that is just a fancy name for something that calculates something for you. It takes into account ones and zeros and does some fancy math for us. Let's go ahead, stop dragging it around, and like this is our CPU. This little literal chip is just usually going to look like a flat top made of metal with some pins underneath. On some processors, you might find that it's a flat metal gold, where in other cases you'll find pins. That will actually define the type of CPU you're using, and usually defines whether it's Intel or AMD, which are competitors in the CPU market. But let's move on and install this. Usually it involves the process of installing this little shield to keep our processor in place. Thermal paste, because they actually get really, really warm. And an involved cooler, which is just a fan to make sure that our CPU doesn't overheat from doing too much math. Let me zoom out, make sure I have this correct. Connect my fan, and now a graphics card. What purpose does a graphics card hold? Well, it does the math that the CPU does, but it does it in a way where it's better at drawing than it is drawing pixels one by one across your screen. A GPU will spit it all out and process an entire image in the matter of a tenth of a second, whereas a CPU will take its time to properly calculate everything out. So installation's pretty easy. Looks something like this. You'll usually find these pins, which allow us to connect it to the PCIe that I had explained earlier. So let's get past the installation part, and boom, just like that, that little slot right here where we can, where it actually kind of fits just like a Lego piece, and you'll find that to be the common case when it comes to building computers. Now finally, the memory. And when I'm talking memory, I'm not talking storage space. I'm actually talking RAM, or RAM, for random access memory. This serves the purpose of keeping track of information that's currently running on your computer. Kind of like when you load a web browser, it keeps track of what page you're on, what the page looks like, and a bunch of other different factors. So it will look like this little stick, and just like our GPU, it's just gonna take a little click in, and let me get a better shot for this. Boom, just like that, we have our RAM, and finally, our hard drive. Let's go ahead and try and speed through this just to finish up. We have our hard drive, or HDD, which is a hard disk drive, meaning there's a literal disk inside spinning in order for us to be able to read the information. If you've never seen a CD before, essentially what we're doing with this technology is lasering a bunch of memory into a small, very small scribble that can be reread as ones and zeros. So in this case, let's just go ahead, install this, slide this in, connect this cable, which will power our drive, and then connect this SATA cable, which will transfer the memory. Now finally, additional cooling. This is for if you're running higher end computers where the CPU and GPU can get very warm and actually end up taking a lot of, creating a lot of heat, which can cause for a overload. So let's go ahead and finish off by installing the outer sheets of the tower, and like that we can go ahead and start our computer. So to quickly review, I'm going to go ahead and plug these in, but while I'm doing so, our main takeaways will be primarily the PSU, the power supply unit, CPU, central processing unit, GPU, graphics processing unit, as well as our motherboard and our hard drives. Those essential key items are what make a computer, and you'll find them universally across almost any device. Hopefully you'll join us next week, where we'll talk about operating systems and exactly how they affect the interface of us actually using them. Hope you'll join.